and this was marked by Whitman with his copy, as you can see, and indeed it leads to the trope of leaves of grass. Man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright in the Adamic posture. He dares not say, I think I am, but quotes some saint or sage. He is ashamed before the blade of grass or the blowing rose, and then because he knows exactly what he's doing, he is, as you can see already, anything but a naive or a simplistic writer. He's horribly knowing. He is horribly sophisticated. It would be impossible, I think, to deconstruct him because it is the most self-deconstructing discourse that anybody in the West has ever written. Look what he does here. He is ashamed before the blade of grass or the blowing rose. These roses under my window make no reference to former roses. How can he say that? Or to better ones. They are for what they are. They exist with God today. There is no time today. There is simply the rose. It is perfect in every moment of its existence. It was, as you might guess, a passage that Gertrude Stein fell in love with also. It's a very influential passage. Before a leaf bud has burst, its whole life acts. In the full-blown flower there is no more. In the leafless root there is no less. Its nature is satisfied, and it satisfies nature in all moments alike. And then it is an attack on Hegel. It's full of sly attacks on Hegelianism, but it also is an advancing attack on Freud. But man postpones or remembers. He does not live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or heedless of the riches that surround him, stands on tiptoes to foresee the future. This is again an anti-Hegelian law. He cannot be happy and strong until he too lives with nature in the present, above time. Then he has the gall to say, this should be plain enough. But then goes on to say, we shall not always set so great a price on a few texts, on a few lives. Now, though one would like to be an Emersonian, obviously I am not. I set a very great price on Milton. I set a very great price on the text of the Ovid, or the text of Freud. I set a much too great a price on the life of Freud, as I suppose a Christian would say, too great a price on the life of St. Paul, and the price beyond, hurled on the life of Jesus. All this is being challenged. The question is, in the name of what? Turn the page, and one has the strangest paragraph even this strange writer ever wrote. I want to read it out loud, and I want to talk about it, because that famous American category which forms our literature, the American sublime, where all writers afterwards, whether they're being ironic or sardonic about it, or whether they are celebrating it, this is the passage that they mean. This is the passage of the American daimonic. After he says at the end of the previous paragraph, if we live truly, we shall see truly. It is as easy for the strong man to be strong, vocabulary of course taken over by Nietzsche and by Bloom, to go from the sublime to the less sublime, as it is for the weak to be weak. When we have new perception, we shall gladly disburden the memory of its hoarded treasures. Now that means Shakespeare, as he goes on to tell you elsewhere, as old rubbish. That would be very difficult for me to accept. When a man lives with God, his voice, the man's own voice, shall be as sweet as the murmur of the brook and the rustle of the corn, and then you get this count. And now at last the highest truth on this subject remains unsaid. Probably cannot be said. For all that we say is the far-off remembering of the intuition. That thought, and he's saying I can't say it, but look, I'll try to approach it. That thought by what I can now nearest approach to say it is this. And you go back shortly to the transparent eyeball passage, where you will remember you did not hear any name except your own, where the voice or the memory of the nearest friend or brother or acquaintance was not there at all. When good is near you, when you have life in yourself, it is not by any known or accustomed way. So it can't come to you from a tradition or a mode. You shall not discern the footprints of any other. You shall not see the face of man. You shall not hear any name. It has to come from an unnaming. The way the thought of which shall be wholly strange and new. It shall exclude example and experience, because experience is a lower mode, and example is only anteriority. You take away from man, not to man. Again, one of Nietzsche's favorite sentences, out of it will come the Uber men. All persons that ever existed are forgotten ministers, where the crucial word is forgotten. Fear and hope are alike beneath it, because he's now attacking the notion of hope and even joy in the romantic imagination as expressed in the compensatory imagination of Wordsworth and opponent. For that he was a much grimmer kind of compensation. They are somewhat low even in hope. And here one hears the chant proper. In the hour of vision, there is nothing that can be called gratitude nor properly joy. And we correct that directly against the English romantics. The soul raised over passion, not by or in passion, beholds identity and eternal causation, because it is back before the creation. It is indeed in what the Gnostics call the abyss, which is foremother and forefather, perceives the self-existence of truth and right, which means not by any anteriority, and calms itself with knowing that all things go well. One sees why Nietzsche admired this passage also. His version of it was to write, just take one step more and forgive yourself. Give yourself grace. Then Nietzsche adds the entire drama, fall and atonement is played out in yourself, and you have saved yourself. But Emerson is already a little bit beyond that, because nobody needs any kind of salvation. Everything already is going well. That faces with nature. And here one hears that sublime contempt of space and time. The Atlantic Ocean, the South Sea, long intervals of time, years, centuries are of no account. This which I think and feel, just a second, you see, underlay. I look at this movement from underlay to underlie, every former state of life and circumstances, as it does underlie my present and what is called life and what is called death. And then the really frightening doctrine. He suddenly says, stop even talking about self-reliance. He throws out his own vocabulary. Life only avails not to having lived. And then, perhaps the most crucial sentence in him, power ceases in the instant of repose. It exists only in transition. It exists only in a crossing. It resides in the moment of transition when they pass to a new state, in the shooting of the goal, in the darting to an aim. This one fact the world hates, and he's quite right. The world cannot tolerate this. Indeed, it's very hard to know how we can live with this fact, that the soul becomes, so that forever degrades the past, brings all riches to poverty, all reputation to a shame, confounds the saints with the road, shoves Jesus and Judas equally aside. Why then do we prate of self-reliance? A brilliant rhetorical stroke, since he's been prating of self-reliance. Inasmuch as the soul is present, there will be power, which is finally the crucial word, power, not confident but agent. To talk of reliance is a poor external way of speaking. Speak rather of that which relies because it works and is. What is the ultimate audacity of that as a doctrine? And that is certainly the early Emerson. And that always in some sense remains what Emerson called power. And that is indeed, the Emersonian religion. That is the heart of certainly the most vital and peculiar difference that is set forth in the literature or ideology or thought or tropology, call it what you will, of this country. That remains the difference ultimately between us and the Europeans. It is perfectly wild. It is perfectly crazy. What are its dimensions? What's its shrewdness? I call it wild and crazy, but I'm only emulating Emerson in that. Emerson defines wildness as freedom, or freedom as wildness. The two are the same. Thoreau, of course, takes that over from him, so do Dickinson and Whitman, so do a host of 19th and 20th century American writers. What's the shrewdness of it? What makes it difficult, once you encounter this, not to apply something of his own doctrine to it? That is to say, if this is being successful at all, I'm presenting it to you pell-mell, but I'm trying to dramatize it and I'm trying to throw it out all at you at once, because it's the only way I think one can handle it now. You can't sneak up on it, and you can't try to present it in a rather traditional or academic kind of a way. Using the doctrine of the luster, as he calls it, or the trope of the luster, in what sense is it your own rejected or repressed thought which returns to you in an essay like Self-Reliance or the passages from nature that we will let together? What to speak of relying is he as a rhetorician relying upon, as an orator? What is he relying upon in you as an auditor or reader? So to ask it very simply, what is the appeal of this? What is the power of this? That the power in it is unmistakable, I think, can be viewed simply in terms of that pragmatism that Emerson himself first invented. There are very few American ways of thinking and feeling that do not find a root somewhere in Emerson. And one of them certainly is the whole question of the pragmatic stance, that only a difference that makes a difference is a difference. What is the difference? that he has experimented. I mean, one sees, of course, where this will lead to. It was no accident that Henry Ford pasted all over his offices and all over his first plans little mottos from self-reliance. And it certainly did lead to the most anarchic and horrible aspects of American monopoly capitalism in its expansionist phase in the later 19th and earlier 20th century. And to this day, it can always be argued by all of our leading reactionaries and conservatives that they are perfectly Emersonian in their doctrine, socially considered. On the other hand, every movement against anteriority that has been undertaken in our country, whether cultural or political, social, economic, has also tended to be made in his name also. So that the element of the social or the element of left or right tends to disappear in the context of Emerson. So obviously there's a reason for that in this also. If no anteriority, then pure solipsism. If pure solipsism, then both the external world and other selves count for a lot less than the expansive or oldest or most real element in your own consciousness. The doctrine is nakedly egoistic. The doctrine is nakedly anti-social. The doctrine is nothing but anti-historical. In some sense, it must indeed be called anti-cultural in its its implications. It not only did it make an enormous appeal, so that one cannot conceive either of the positive or negative relations, I mean, just as Poe, Melville, Hawthorne are simply not conceivable without their strong, really frightened and angry reaction against Emerson, so Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman are not conceivable without their rather remarkable positive reaction. The famous remark of Whitman, I was seething, seething, seething. Emerson brought me to a boil, is still, in its quaint way, a perfectly good American trope for what the experience of reading Emerson is. I myself, in the middle of the journey, when I was 35 years old in 1965, I experienced the most frightening conversion to Emerson. It certainly changed my work, it changed my life, it changes the way I look at things. Though I am of necessity a bad Emersonian, because if you were a good Emersonian, I'm not sure you could live another 20 minutes. At least in the way our society is now constituted. But that, of course, is a reproach, a very complicated reproach, and ultimately it isn't just a reproach to Emerson. So the first thing to notice about it is one of the strangest of paradoxes. You know, when I was a schoolboy, or when I was a graduate student, or even when I was a younger teacher, one of the shibboleths bequeathed by what was in those days called the New Criticism was that you didn't have to bother to read Emerson at all because he was somehow the most boring and tame and mild and genteel principle of authors. If it was anything of the kind. He is very crazy, he is very frightening, he is very wild, he is anarchic in the deepest degree, and if he had his way, we could not go on the way we go on at all. How did that paradox come about? What is there about this mode, almost the impossibility of this mode, or the impossibility of these suggestions, which led to that sort of extraordinary kind of weak misreading of him, which produced that figure who never existed, the figure called Emerson in quotation marks, who is so different from the actual text. I'm asking again, what is the appeal of the text? What is the appeal of the passages I have read aloud and at least in part analyzed and tried to present? What is the affective appeal of it? Set aside from the cognitive appeal, which may be another different, it may be a very different matter.
Well, it certainly gives one a lot of freedom. In a sense, at least it gives one the permission to do what one wants to do. Or
No, you can't do it. Well, the initial cost is so overwhelming that I hardly know that what you're saying can, strictly speaking, be so. If you have to surrender, you know, Freud has an endless contest, it seems to me, at least as I read him, and as I try to present him to you, he has an endless contest, and it's not so hidden either, with anteriority. He has a very deep grudge against all conceptualizations which precede his own. He cannot really be said to be building upon what comes before him, not in his most fundamental notions. That fundamental map of the mind that he finally gives you is shockingly original. And to this day, there's something moving about it if you contrast it with earlier maps of the mind. He himself says that he had come to give the third blow to our pride or preconceptions, insisting that Copernicus and Darwin had dealt the first two, and that he was dealing the third and the decisive blow. It's difficult now to think of him in terms of Copernicus and Darwin. It is very possible to think of him in terms of being a speculator on the scale, say, of Plato. So Plato obviously has a dialectical strength and cunning and an endless analytical quality which will withstand, as far as I can tell, any kind of analytical or ironic scrutiny, as a text of Freud probably cannot withstand. Freud can withstand it rhetorically, but he cannot withstand it argumentatively. Emerson does not argue at all. He exhorts. He doesn't pretend to argue. He's not interested in argument for a single moment. He is a rhetorician working in an ancient tradition of rhetoric. He is an orator, a kind of prophetic orator, who stands there in front of you and delivers this rather extraordinary kind of discourse, which is meant to make an immediate difference. It is meant to change the way you act and think and move and have your being. But he breaks from the entire tradition of rhetoric by trying to teach you not to live in society, not to teach you to be more deft or adept in dealing with yourself or with your neighbor or with society, but insisting that you must begin by throwing all of anteriority overboard. Now, obviously, it had in the first place a very definite meaning in the late 1820s and throughout the 1830s and still in the 1840s and still in his last major phase as you go up towards the Civil War at the 1850s lengthen. It had a very definite meaning. It had a meaning in terms of American cultural nationalism. He was not directing his discourse to young men and young women who were desperately in need of some sense of anteriority, as all young men and young women are these days, but to those who he felt were already too strongly bound by an anteriority which was not their own because it was not American. So he was obviously, in the first place, a cultural kind of a polemicist. There clearly is a timeless aspect of this also, which has very little to do with this situation as somebody who is enunciating his doctrine or setting forth these radical tropes in the early 1830s or in the 1840s or wherever. There's another kind of an occupation on his part when he's dealing with a religious writer. I think ultimately that is why he resembles Freud, because I suppose the way in which I differ from almost anybody else, whatever Freudian school, who writes about Freud or tries to teach Freud, is that it seems to me that Freud, who sets out to be an anti-religious writer, is nothing but a religious writer. And as I said to you before, the J writer doesn't seem to me to be a religious writer at all, but something quite different. I know an impossible kind of paradox. Emerson is a religious writer. He sets out to be a religious writer. The religion is self-reliance or self-worship. And of course, one wonders what that means in pragmatic terms. Well, he puts it to an experiential test. So since it cannot be answered, I think, directly on the shock value of the self-reliance, I'd say, look with me at the essay Experience, where one is dealing with an entity which is sustained and which is organized as an essay, and where the very title is meant to be a self-reproach. Experience is, as he himself says, I go back to his essay called The Transcendentalist, which I didn't ask you to read, but just to read a particular moment from it. He says, as thinkers, mankind are divided into two sects, materialists and idealists, or with respect, empiricists and transcendentalists. The first class, materialists, founding on experience; the second, idealists, on consciousness. So if you're adopting experience, you are taking the materialist stance, or Epicurean stance, or the Cretan stance, which of course becomes the Jungian stance, or the stance of British empiricism, down to say a British empiricist like Richard Walheim, who is hard at work, reading Freud to this day and giving a very different reading of Freud indeed than anything that we can find on the part of a continental. So here you have a fiercely transcendental or idealist kind of a writer, but idealist in a very un-European way. If Hegel is an idealist, then the chances are you have to call Emerson something else. But of course, Emerson is not a philosopher. The question is, well, what is he? Here he's trying to write an essay on experience. He's saying, all right, what if I grant empiricism its presuppositions? What if Hume is right about everything and Immanuel Kant is wrong about everything? What if ultimately Epicurus was right about everything and Plato was wrong about everything? If you accept the experiential stance and write an experiential essay about life, where will you find yourself? Someone has the text here in front of us, and I ask you to look at the very beginning of it. Look at the second paragraph of it. There's an introductory poem. There's a first paragraph, which is a deliberate phantasmagoria, which brilliantly describes ordinary experiential perception. What happens when you reduce the world to a series of, as it were, atomistic, perceptive, isolated moments. If you yield yourself to pure experience, he says, oddly enough, you seem to be caught in a consistent phantasmagoria. He has a kind of point there. But what he does with the point is most peculiar. What is he getting at in that next paragraph? What does the experiential stance lead to? If any of us knew what we were doing or where we are going, then we think we best know. We do not know today whether we are busy or idle, and then it gets very interesting indeed. In times when we thought ourselves indolent, we have afterwards discovered that much was accomplished and much was begun in us. All our days are so unprofitable while they pass that it is wonderful where or when we ever got anything of this which we call wisdom, poetry, virtue. We never got it on any dated calendar day. And then you have a beautiful sentence worthy of Sir Thomas Browne and in his mode, really. Some heavenly days must have been intercalated somewhere, like those that Hermes won with dice of the moon, that Osiris might be born. He's taking that from the Egyptian legend of Isis and Osiris that he had read in Plutarch, one of his favorite sources. It is said all martyrdoms looked mean when they were suffered. And now you get a series of twisted proverbs, all of which make the same point, and it's an experiential point, and the consequence of experience. What is that point? And that is to ask a literary question. What do these tropes enforce as their lesson? Every ship is a romantic object except that we sail in. Embark and the romance quits our vessel and hangs on every other sail on the horizon. Our life looks trivial and we shun to record it. Men seem to have learned of the horizon the art of perpetual retreating and records. Yonder uplands are rich pasturage, my neighbor has fertile meadow, but my field, says the perilous farmer, only holds the world together. I quote another man saying, unluckily that other withdraws himself in the same way and quotes me. "'Tis the trick of nature, or of experience, thus to degrade today. A great deal of buzz and somewhere results slip magically in. Every roof is agreeable to the eye until it is lifted. Then we find tragedy in moaning women and hard-eyed husbands, and the illusions of Lethe, and the men ask what's the news, the old were so bad. So much of our time, I jump ahead, is preparation. So much is routine, and so much retrospect that the tenth of each man's genius contracts itself to a very few hours. And then as he goes on in the same mode, it turns very striking and peculiar. Less than 2 years ago, his son Waldo, in every way the apple of his eye, to use that grand biblical phrase, had suddenly died. A little boy dead of tuberculosis before he was 7 years old. People grieve and bemoan themselves, this is after that quotation, but it is not half so bad to them as they say. There are moods in which we court suffering in the hope that, and this too is experiential, here at least we shall find reality, sharp peaks and edges of truth. It turns out to be scene-changing and counterfeit. Now you find yourself in a very strange contrast state before his essay on mourning and melancholia. The only thing grief has taught me is to know how shallow it is. That, like all the rest, plays about the surface, grief itself, and never introduces me into the reality, the contact with which we could even pay the costly price of sons and love in such other ways spiritually left the origin of the H. Lawrence's title. Then a really nutty reference. Boscovich was a particularly crazy 17th century physicist, a Jesuit, who had formulated a particularly nutty atomistic theory of matter, in which he claimed that no atom could ever touch any other atom, and this is what was responsible for all our sorrows. It was Bostonist who found out that bodies never come in contact, while souls never touch their objects. An innavigable sea washes with silent waves between us and the things we aim and converse with. Grief, too, will make us idealists, that is to say, transcendentalists, and not experientialists. That is to say, even grief estranges you from the object, and in shocking sentences that shock people when he wrote them, and they haven't lost their shock value now, and then I'll stop and ask you what the point is. In the death of my son, now more than 2 years ago, I seem to have lost a beautiful estate, no more. He's not older than the rest of us, so I'll tell him. I cannot get it nearer to me. If tomorrow I should be informed of the bankruptcy of my principal debtors, the loss of my property would be a great inconvenience to me perhaps for many years, but it would leave me as it found me, neither better nor worse. It is very close to Freud's dark wisdom of saying the therapy of therapies is not to invest too much libido in any object whatsoever. So it is with this calamity. And if Emerson is not saying what Freud is saying, what's the difference? It does not touch me. Something which I fancied was a part of me, which could not be torn away without hearing me, nor enlarged without enriching me, falls off from me and leaves no scar. Not even, indeed, what Freud would call a narcissistic scar. It was caducous, that is to say, hermetic, like the wand of Hermes. I grieve that grief can teach me nothing, nor carry me one step into real nature. Any ship you sail is the wrong ship. This is somehow never the place. You are never the person. Anything that's happening is not happening to you. Grief, which is supposed to be the most profound emotion, still does not put you in touch with the object. All this is said from the experiential or empiric or materialist stance. What kind of a critique is it? Yeah.
I just wanted more different from the stories up at here.
Well, what would the answer to that be? Since he is, after all, taking up the empirical, or in this case, Epicurean, or call it nowadays the Freudian stance, or the Jungian stance, since he is supposedly taking up the viewpoint of the empiric, those who found themselves upon experience rather than upon consciousness, distinguishing between experience and consciousness, what would the Stoic point of view have been? A Stoic is not founding himself or herself, an ancient Stoic, upon experience rather than consciousness. The Stoics despised the Epicureans and had far more in common with the Platonists. And he is saying that precisely what he is talking about cannot therefore be what happens when you found yourself upon consciousness. This is not even at the level of an apatheia, because an apatheia is a conscious discipline. It is the trained moment in consciousness. This is something else. What is this something else? We have a name for it. We have a name for it all the time. No, we call it alienation or estrangement, or we call it a sense of being, it's what Stevens, writing a version of this, speaks of in the poem called St. John and the Backache, the dumbfoundering abyss between ourselves and the object, which uses both Freudian and Emersonian language to talk about the impossibility of either object relations or of object perception. Well, what is it doing there as a mode? Look, he has set out in this essay by saying, I will not write an essay on self-reliance. I will not be a transparent eyeball. I will not insist that it's our business to so turn the acts of the vision and the acts of the things so that we behold transparently, without a sense of inferiority or the pressure of time. I will look at things as though they were opaque. I will be an empiricist. I will be a materialist. I will deal in the realm of fact. And then he starts telling you what? Wittgenstein, by the way, admired this essay, and one sees what? Montaigne, upon whom partly, by the way, it is based, because there's a deep and direct debt. Emerson's two favorite authors were Plutarch and Montaigne. That in itself indicates something about the kind of thing that Emerson is writing. It was the Moralia, Plutarch, not the lives of the eminent Greeks and Romans, but these endless little essays on everything and anything. And he thought that of all writers who had ever written, it was the skeptic Montaigne who engrossed him most. Yet Emerson is no skeptic, so there is a puzzle there as well. Plutarch was no Platonist, so he played at a kind of Platonism. What is the mode that you're writing here? I mean, one calls this alienation, but alienation is too grand or philosophical a term for this. Look, this is something we suffer from at every moment. What? Yeah, this is blankness, exactly. Very clever, I think, on your part. If you take the empirical stance, you will behold an opacity or a blankness, all right. That is to say, alienate yourself, if you prefer alienation as a mode, from consciousness to that degree. Say that you would take up the Bohemian point of view, or the Humean point of view. If you really try to live like that, you will rapidly find yourself in difficulty, which is that far more than any idealist or transcendentalist, you will be trapped in a phantasmagoria. Schopenhauer once made that point, and Wittgenstein picked that up from him. It appears in the Tractatus of Wittgenstein as the extraordinary statement, what the solipsist says is wrong, but what the solipsist means is right. A Schopenhauerian observation, of course, as Wittgenstein was the first to know. And if you look at Max Black's edition of the Tractatus, he will pin down the place in the world's moral representation that is taken from. What is Wittgenstein's point? Because it's very close to Emerson's point here. What the solipsist says is wrong, but what the solipsist means is right. Because if you take solipsism far enough, then it refutes a simplistic kind of empiricism or materialism and puts you in the true problematic that you have to deal with, according to Wittgenstein, which in the Tractatus is, of course, a problematic of language, but a very different problematic of language than is being given us by the French these days. But let's stick to that statement, because Emerson would have been delighted with that sentence, as Schopenhauer would have been. And Emerson and Schopenhauer have perhaps more in common in the end than Emerson and Nietzsche. What the solipsist says is wrong, but what the solipsist means is right. What does that mean? That's a famous sentence from the Tractatus, from the earlier masterpiece of Wittgenstein. What does that statement evidently mean? Well, read it the way you would. You could insert it into Emerson in almost any point that would find the right context. What must that mean? I mean, solipsism, from Aristotle on, we've been told, is self-refuting. To deny reality to your neighbors or the external world is ultimately self-refuting, because you wind up either a beast or a madman, but not a human being, or else you will have to be a god. But solipsism otherwise will finally experientially refute itself. What it says is wrong, what it means is right. What it means is what Emerson means here. And he's giving it to you really in a New England kind of a fashion. He's giving it to you almost as proverb. It's not a philosophical lesson. That attitude in which you can't understand how you ever got any work done, because you can't find the moment in which you ever did it. You spend your life fretting. Your experience always comes to you under the aspect of negation, he is telling you. If you set out with an overvaluation of experience and an undervaluation of consciousness, which is what he's deliberately done against the grain in this essay, then you will find that you never know how you ever managed to get anything done. You will also never know how you ever managed to attach any value to yourself or to anyone else, how you ever managed to make love to anybody, how you ever managed to do any writing, how you ever managed to get anything successfully read and recognized as having been made part of your knowledge. Because what is he getting at? The self-deprecating tendency, which devalues every particular moment and every particular encounter. No ship sails if we are a passenger in it. This cannot be the place, because I am standing in it. This cannot be happening, because it is happening to me. I mean, the parody of it is the famous Groucho Marxist adage, I wouldn't be a member of any club that would have me for a member. That finally is the experiential kind of a turn. And so what is he getting at in writing this essay? I mean, I wanted to trace it through the three recoveries, or the three moments in which he violently reacts against this. And perhaps there will be time, but I want to take this back into the earlier doctrine. If the meaning of the earlier doctrine is that if you found yourself on experience rather than consciousness, then what is it to found yourself upon consciousness when the consciousness must exclude anteriority? But Hegel founds himself upon consciousness. but it is a consciousness that tries to distinguish between a false consciousness and a true consciousness. Given facts are always wrong, according to Hegel, which is his argument against the Jungians and the empiricists. A process of negation has got to take place so that, on the one hand, self-consciousness through negativity becomes a purified self-consciousness, and the given fact is properly dissolved into a true universal by getting rid of what is local or accidental in it. That is the found upon consciousness with a vengeance. That leads to the whole major movement of continental, metaphysical, and then anti-metaphysical philosophy, you can say from Hegel through Heidegger to Derrida, and what is going on at the moment. So when Emerson speaks of founding upon consciousness, he does not mean that. There are too many little anti-Hegelian sly remarks scattered through him for him to mean that. And one thing he would have in common with Schopenhauer, who shows no sign of ever having read. He evidently read Hegel, and in his notebook he finally says a couple of very funny things about Hegel. Evidently he'd never heard about Schopenhauer, and I think Schopenhauer makes no impact on 19th century America. But he has in common with Schopenhauer a deep distrust of founding yourself upon. Now, Schopenhauer is no empiricist either. Schopenhauer is technically a transcendental idealist, as Emerson is a transcendental idealist. But Emerson has a great deal in common with that tradition that goes from Schopenhauer to Wittgenstein, to the early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, and is a very different tradition from the Hegelian tradition. So that if you're going to compare it to anything continental, you have to compare it to that. It says of consciousness that instead of seeking a universal, you stick to a particular. You stick to a particular idea, you stick to a particular conception of an object, you stick to a particular sense of yourself. You don't try to ground upon a universal. But it's a very strange view of a particular because it excludes anteriority. As Schopenhauer, I think, excludes anteriority. The Hegelian view of history is to see it as being negated in a fulfillment or climax which is represented by his own particular moment in the history of thought and speculation. The Emersonian view, like the Schopenhauerian one, is to say that all anteriority is a terrible kind of a mistake, but for very different reasons. Anteriority is a terrible mistake in Schopenhauer for the same reason that it is in that I think they're out of Schopenhauer and Freud of beyond the pleasure principle. It's a mistake because you are not really getting back to the inorganic. You are not really returning to where the depth drive wants you to be. What about an image? Why is anteriority a mistake? If you ground yourself upon anteriority, then you accept the supremacy of the fact. If you see a fact not in the light of an idea, if you do not call it an epiphany of God, and God in Emerson always simply means what is oldest in yourself. It's a very clear way of theorizing or speculating. It is not philosophy, it is rhetoric. That is to say, it is rhetoric in exactly the sense that sophists were using rhetoric. It is much closer, say, to Gorgias or to Protagoras even, than it is to Plato, and therefore to Plato's Socrates. It presents itself as a rival not to philosophy, but to religion, to Christianity, or to what comes before Christianity in Judaism, or after it in Islam. It presents itself as a rejection of the historical faith. It is a religion not even of the moment, but of that aspect of your own self which you can isolate and project into a future. It locates power in the shooting of a goal, in the darting to an aim, in the betweenness of any concept, rather than the realization of that concept. It is therefore a problematic of energy. It is a vitalism. And it is a very peculiar kind of a vitalism. It has, for instance, say, more in common with the early Lawrence or the early Yeats than with probably most modern authors of any kind whatsoever. I come back to this rejection of anteriority. What is there in common between, and call it just a trope or a figure of speech? Read it, as I think Emerson has to be read, as oratory, as kind of prose poetry. What is there in common between the insistence in the first and last chapters of Nature and throughout the so-called essay, or I would say Rhapsody, Self-Reliance, and here at the opening of the essay on experience, What is there in common between saying in the first place you must reject all anteriority, which is technically, of course, impossible, but you must reject it, even though language traps you in the anterior all the time, and Emerson knows that. Nevertheless, he says, by troping properly, and of course he's right, the only way you have in language of getting away from the burden of being totally imprisoned in anteriority, or what I would call facticity, is to trope successfully. You must trope against the prior tropes in the language if you're to establish a little space for yourself. He insists that this can be done to a point where you are no longer caught suffering the experiential test, where an empirical point of view is not possible for you. When you switch the empirical point of view, he says, look where you are. You are totally trapped in anteriority. But isn't that what has been happening in the essay experience? And isn't that a strange way of talking about the materialist or empirical stance? To make a critique of it, not speculatively, but tropologically, which is what he's done. That's what makes these opening pages of the essay experience rather difficult from a literary point of view. He's saying that if you really give yourself over wholly to experience rather than consciousness, if you really start out against the grain and say, I will be a complete empiric, I will stay away completely from all platonizings of any sort or idealizings of any kind. I choose the opaque. Then he's saying what you are really choosing is that kind of excessive anteriority, which is literalism, in which no tropological deviation will be possible, and then you will find that everything that has been accomplished that is positive for you at all, whether the sense of your own identity or any work you managed to do or any affections you managed to have, all come about by a kind of mystery. That is to say, the emotional or affective cost, he is saying, of taking up the empirical or experiential position is to rob you of trope, is to over-literalize you, and that in turn is to give you what, say, Adler calls, just the opposite of what Adler calls the so-called masculine protest, gives you an inferiority complex. That is what the opening of experience is about. To yield to anteriority, to yield to the literalness of language, to refuse trope, to ground yourself in experience, is to devalue yourself in relation to experience, or in relation to others, or in relation to the past. Is he right? Freud would have insisted that Freud's proudest boast is that he was anything but an idealist. He insisted he was a Helmholtzian, which is as hard a materialist as you could be in the 19th century. And his insistence on dualism comes out of that Helmholtzian materialistic inheritance. His insistence upon a proud reductionism comes out of that also. What would Freud have said to this? Freud would have denied it, surely. I pointed to that particular moment, contra Jung, towards the close of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where Freud insists that he is using figurative language, and that figurative language is dualistic, whereas a literal use of language, such as he insists he finds in Jung, is monistic. What would Emerson's position be? Is he dualist or monist? There is a confusion in this, but it's something that could now, I think, be cleared up. Let me return to that notion that if you strip yourself of trope, if you strip yourself of consciousness, according to Emerson, then you strip yourself of self-esteem. And then you yield to history. And everything becomes history. And oddly enough, when everything becomes history, then you can't understand how anything has ever been accomplished at all. Kind of a way of talking, isn't it? Or, let me rephrase that. Rather than ask you to categorize it, why is that effective? Why is Emerson so hard to refute? Why does he insinuate himself the way he does? And this is a historical statement on my part. I cannot think of an American writer who has been more endlessly influential upon writers who technically are greater than himself as writers. Emerson is, after all, an essayist. His poems are, as he himself would have been the first to tell you, mostly quite second-rate. Never kindles. There are 3 or 4 glorious exceptions. He is capable of extraordinary and almost too continuous eloquence, and yet, in defiance of his own doctrine or vision, what matters about him is that he is endlessly influential, even though he keeps counseling you against being influenced. Insist upon yourself, never imitate, he says in Self-Reliance. And yet, it's precisely that which keeps getting into you. I quote Whitman in Specimen Days. He says, Emersonianism is only this. It is the giant that teaches you how to destroy itself. That is picked up as a trope by Wallace Stevens at the opening of An Ordinary Evening in New Haven, where you get a series of giants that are always at work destroying themselves, and it's being directed against Whitman, who is a fraternity that, as we will see, floods Stevens, that he can never quite get away from, as indeed no American poet has this real power, since Whitman has been able to get away from Whitman. But what is there about this way of talking? And at the moment I'm only interested in it as a way of talking, this mode of oratory, this kind of rhetoric, this insidious rhetoric that Emerson is using. Now, Freud is a rhetorician, but he also gives you argument, and sustained argument, and most of all, I think he gives you speculation, which is not argument and not rhetoric, even though it relies upon rhetoric and sometimes on argument, but finally it is something else. It is not philosophy and it is not science, but it is speculation. Emerson is not even quite giving you speculation. He is giving you rhetoric and showing you what the consequences are if you will not accept rhetoric. But then how is he giving it to you? Now, I go back to the test case that I've used of this before I go on to that essay on fate, where something has happened to him, and that's something I find is quite scary. And it too gets into American writing, and far more important than American writing, I think into American politics, into American ways of feeling and seeing and being, down to this very day. But let me go back to that particular instance, because even if I weary this with you, I think this is as close to the heart of the matter as I can come. If you are at the mercy of anteriority by founding yourself upon experience and rejecting consciousness, think of what that means. The more consciousness is his formula, the less anteriority. The more anteriority, the more merely empiric phantasmagoria, as it were, that you live among, and the less consciousness, including consciousness of self, esteem of sense, self of personal accomplishment. What's clear about that as a way of talking? The more anteriority, the less consciousness. That is, of course, to make of consciousness an originary kind of a force. Where is the Western notion that you become, in some sense, a better consciousness, a better human being through learning or through study come from? That we can identify. Well, Plato ultimately, I mean, it is a Platonic notion. The notion that you can become morally better, as well as intellectually brighter, and indeed, in the religious sense, holy. Even though we sometimes now think of it, and a couple of times when I've said this in front of Jewish audiences, it's made me resolve to have a Jewish audience again in terms of Jewish sponsorship. Whenever you point out the Torah learning idea in Hillel and Akiva and Tarfon was not originally Jewish, but was a Platonic importation, they come very close to wanting to lynch you. But it's quite true. Nowhere in the entire text of the Hebrew Bible, but nowhere, are you told that study will make you holy. Not in one place whatsoever. Nor will you find it before the 2nd century of the Common Era rabbis. You will not find it in what we have of the Pharisees of the 1st century. You will not find it in the rabbinical writings of the 2 or 3 centuries before that. It is a Platonic importation. It is true that a profound modification of it takes place in the 2nd century rabbis, but it is a Hellenic notion and not a Hebraic notion. It is one of the oddities of Western cultural history that normative Judaism, which is a 2nd century Palestinian creation, the creation of Hillel and Tarfon and Akiva and Gamaliel and Ishmael and the other great commentators on Torah is now our notion of what the Jewish attitude towards study is, and you do not, of course, I repeat, in terms of any biblical text whatsoever, you do not become a better person. You do not get in better touch with Yahweh. You do not walk in His ways through study, through reading the 5 books or any other part of the text. So that is indeed a Platonic notion. That is Emerson's most fundamental rebellion. Study is not going to make you better. It is going to make you worse. It's going to diminish your consciousness, and yet this is not a primitivism, any more than it is in Vico, an author whom, by the way, Emerson had pondered and who has deep affinities also. He has affinities with Schopenhauer and the early Wittgenstein on the one side. He has deep affinities with Vico on the other, because Vico also is a writer terribly upset about questions of anteriority, and making a clean split at the beginning, he says, between the true God and the Gentile gods, and therefore a clean split between morality and religion, which go on one side, and poetry and learning, which go on the other. Emerson does the split in another kind of a way. But again, what is the persuasiveness of this as a mode? Even if we don't come on to faith, I want to stay with this a little longer. Because I know of no writer, even though he will keep coming up next week in Whitman, and the week after in Whitman and Stevens, and the week after that in Stevens, I know of no writer who is harder to catch hold of than Emerson, because this is his most slippery and peculiar point. See, it's one thing to say in self-reliance or in nature that the notion that the soul is rather than was is what is hated by all doctrine and by history and by any body of knowledge whatsoever. We can sort of grin at the shock of that and think, well, this is just shock technique. But it's when he writes the essay Experience, or when he will go on to write a more drastic version of it in the essay Faith, or in the essay Circles, where you can find it in almost every paragraph, that he is doing something which is really more alarming. He's saying, what are the pragmatic consequences? What is the difference that the worship of anteriority, or the notion of founding a humanism upon study, has made in us? And he insists it has been wholly bad for us. It was misconceived from the start, because in fact it was always an empirical mode. It was always a materialist mode. And it is, if you adopt that mode, you are not only overvaluing anteriority and devaluing the self, but you have religion the wrong way around. Now, the funny link there, I think in the end, is that curious link between trope, or figurative language, or the possibility of escaping the trap of anteriority, which after all is most preserved in language, by means of departures from the literal. But if you work that out pragmatically in the essay Experience, which is, I think, his most profound and peculiar essay, then you have a very odd kind of a doctrine, which is very hard to trace, but it would go evidently something like this. Ground yourself on empiricism, ground yourself upon history, and the two are the same. Ground yourself upon observation, as it were. It's the same as grounding yourself upon tradition, even though technically it isn't. The empiric is always saying, isn't he? I will take you out of tradition, and I will give you actuality. Emerson is saying these are two ways of falling victim to the anteriority of language, which is in the end only a trope for the anteriority of things. If you are interested in new life in yourself, if you are interested in yourself, if you are interested in not just being trapped in a kind of phantasmagoric flux of impressions, which will only delude you of any high valuation of yourself, start with a different premise entirely. Start with the transparency. Start with the notion that there is something in yourself which is no part of the creation. How would that relate to the essay Experience? If what matters most in you is no part of the creation, and that I think is in the end the most complex moment in Emerson. But from a Freudian point of view, that isn't even nonsense, is it? If you start with the supposition that there is what Freud would have called a psychic instance or agency, which is not part of nature, then according to Freud, you would be involved in the worst kind of supernaturalism. But supernaturalism, according to Emerson, is itself the worship of anteriority, and comes down through all, and he would insist that this is something pragmatic, that this is something which does make a difference. What does it mean, after all, to say, and of course he is reviving an ancient Gnosticism in this, whether he knew this or not, what does it mean to say that there is an element in you which precedes the creation? What could it mean, just in terms of trope? Yeah.
Well, violent history. Violent is a self-inflicted. Free the person from responsibility.
Well, he would have denied that, of course. It certainly frees you from social responsibility, I suppose. But it does not free you from responsibility for and towards yourself. It has always been felt, I think, by civil society, that which could be called Gnosticism or Orphism, both under different names at different times, or Emersonian self-reliance, it has always been felt to be insupportable, and it has always been thrown out by humanisms of one kind or another, not so much because it leads to social irresponsibility, but because it leads to the notion that the individual is in no way stained by his or her experience. It leads indeed to the notion of perfection. It leads to antinomianism. And that is the heart of the matter. Because what is Emersonian antinomianism, or what indeed is any antinomianism? It isn't necessarily libertinism on the one hand, or asceticism on the other, which are the extreme parodies of it in one direction or the other, as it is what, finally? Not even the sense of being beyond good or evil in the Nietzschean kind of a polemic, but it is something else. What would that something else be? How would it relate to a total rejection of anteriority? Well, every nomos, every law, whether it be Torah, or a body of civil law, or a body of established philosophical or scientific truths, is anterior. It can only be established as anterior and then be given to you as a more or less finished product. If you start out with the perspective that what is most valuable in you is no part of the creation, that everything that has taken place in history or in a nomos of any kind comes after that, then you're in a very serious kind of a situation, particularly if you're being told, to go back to that Rita's sublime notion, that anything that can touch you, anything that can move you, anything that you can respond to, because it really does call out to what is oldest and best in you, is also a statement which belies anteriority. I think it is finally an attack upon, to sort of get to the point as quickly as I can in the few moments one has left, though we will keep coming back to these Emersonian texts in relation to Song with Myself next week, because that antinomian stance and that freedom from history is being assumed in the opening lines of the poem that in its later version is called Song of Myself. It opens, I celebrate myself. It doesn't go on to say in the original version, and sing myself. I celebrate myself. And what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. And he says creeds and doctrines in advance, setting them aside, and then goes on to another way of talking. He is saying, look, I stand here, Whitman is saying, I stand here before the creation. The creation is an event in history, even if it is sacred history. It is a falling away from something which was more original. I restore the trope of what was original. But what is the trope of what was original? In the priestly author, not in the Yahwist, we don't know what that would have been. For him, it is the abyss. It is tohu and bohu. It is the primeval night and the primeval ocean. Emerson at his close, beyond the essay Fate, and it's something I had to read today. I'll sum him up for now in this way, and we'll break apart for this on the day, but I think this is the essence of it also. He says there may be, he writes it in his notebook, towards the end. There may be 2 or 3 or 4 steps according to the genius of each. But for every seeing soul, S-E-E-I-N-G, soul, S-O-U-L, for every seeing soul, there are finally just 2 facts, I and the abyss. Well, that is a kind of compendium of what we've been looking at today. There may be 2 or 3 or 4 steps according to the genius of each. But for every seeing soul, every transparent eyeball, everyone who is not caught in opacity and anteriority, there are finally just 2 facts. And empiricism will not give them to you. I and the abyss. The problem is, are they 2 facts or 1? And I think ultimately Emerson would say they are just 1 fact. So it is a doctrine which pragmatically is that nihilism that Nietzsche said he dreaded, and which he sensed already existed in Emerson. There is a nihilism, I think, at the heart of what to this day could be called the psychic ideology of this country. And we will certainly see it develop with great power by Whitman. But let us break off there for today without any feeling that we have solved the conundrum. And let me ask you this, in addition to bringing the Whitman with you next time and having read song with myself in its 2 versions, hopefully, but at least in its final version, bring the text of Emerson back with you so we can contrast some passages.